these missile strikes on the energy system, not so much to knock it out as to discover its weak points and to degrade it in order to make it a more vulnerable target when the big missile strikes eventually came in support of whatever big offensive the Russians were intending to launch. And I suspect that is still true. But it's now absolutely clear to me, and has been commented on by many people, that the immediate purpose of these attacks on the energy system was to deplete the Ukrainian air defense system. The Ukrainians had to expend a very large proportion of their arsenal of S-300 surface-to-air missiles in order to defend this energy system. And the result has been significant gaps now in their air defense network, which they're finding it extremely difficult to fill. And it's interesting that the US government, in its latest assessments, its latest statement of weapon systems that it is going to deliver to Ukraine, has emphasized the need to provide air defense systems, though it's also increasingly clear to me that the United States doesn't have the means to fill the gap. So, to fill in the gaps. So that's why we're seeing the Russian Air Force more active now. And as I said, it was more active over the last few days. There was a report early on during the Russian air offensive in the Financial Times, as I remember, which made exactly that point. And we see that this is exactly how things have turned out. Now, that doesn't mean that the Russians won't come after the energy system eventually. I suspect they will. But as I said, for the moment, I think they've probably degraded it to a certain level. They will presumably continue to hammer it from day to day and from time to time, just to keep it at its same degraded level. But they have significantly weakened Ukraine's air defense system, perhaps the most important asset that Ukraine, military asset that Ukraine had in advance of the war. And we're starting to see the consequences of all of that. Anyway, before I finally wrap up on military news, just one last detail, which is that the London Times that has now come up with a long discussion of the failed, in fact, in my opinion, crazy Ukrainian attempt back in October to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. And apparently around 600 people were involved, 30 boats were used. Anyway, the Times has given a detailed account of the operation, which, from what I can see, corresponds exactly with what the Russians were saying at the time. Now, here again, I have to admit an error. When I first heard reports about these attacks on the Zaporozhye power station coming from the Russians, I found them so outlandish, so bizarre, that I thought they couldn't possibly be true. And I said that it looked to me as if this was a case of the Russians engaging in a certain amount of propaganda by inventing Ukrainian attacks which hadn't happened. And my recollection is that at the time, pretty much all of Ukrainian channels were denying that these attacks were taking place. And of course, the Western media were ignoring these attacks. Well, here we now have this report by the London Times. It seems the attacks did take place. They were completely unsuccessful, just as the Russians said. The pattern of the attacks was, as I said, identical to what the Russians were claiming. The denials were false, and my initial doubt, skepticism about these attacks, they turned out to be entirely wrong. I will say this for myself, I did eventually come round to accepting that the Russians were getting it right and that there were Ukrainian attacks on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I found it bizarre then. I still find it bizarre today. And I wonder who it was who came up with this idea. And I wonder whether that person has suffered any consequences, any career consequences for sending brave men to their deaths on what was clearly a fool's errand. I doubt it, actually. Anyway, there we go. That's all I am going to say about the situation on the battlefronts today. I'm going to say a few things now about Macron's trip to Beijing, because I discussed it yesterday. I hadn't realized when I discussed the program yesterday the full extent of the debacle. It seems that over the course of Macron's visit with Xi Jinping, he was repeatedly bringing up the question of Ukraine, that Xi Jinping was showing increasing signs of frustration and impatience, that he was sighing at various points during the discussion, that Xi Jinping stuck to the well-known and well-established Chinese position about the conflict in Ukraine, but Macron insisted on ploughing on regardless. Now, I think the Chinese were definitely offended and annoyed by all of this, but more to the point, it's clear to me that Macron has massively lost face, and there are now articles starting to appear in the Western media which basically acknowledge the debacle. Now, some of them are appearing in the English language media, Politico, the Daily Telegraph. I think the ones that are going to do Macron the most harm are those which are starting to appear in the French media, Le Monde, Figaro, Les Echos, apparently other places, all discussing how Macron found Xi Jinping immovable, but refused to take no for an answer. And I have to say, yet again, this is very much in the character of Emmanuel Macron. As I said previously in my video yesterday, when in the run-up to the start of the fighting in February, he made those trips to Moscow, he actually lost a lot of goodwill with the Russians by talking for hours about ideas that they could never pin down and basically giving all the impression of pressuring them to try to call off the conflict, even though he was never making anything more than vague assurances which never translated into actual promises of proper discussions. Anyway, it looks as if Macron has done the same thing to himself with the Chinese. The Chinese are not in conflict with France. They're not in conflict with the European Union in the way that the Russians are. It's clear from reading the Chinese media that though the Chinese were frustrated by Macron's behavior, they're not going to themselves initiate any cutback of contacts with France or with Europe. Hardly in their interest to do so. But as I said, it's clear that Xi Jinping, in Xi Jinping's eyes, Macron has lost face. Now, for the record, let me repeat a point which I made in a recent video that has been published on the Duran, which was made by Alex Christoforou and myself, in which we touched on Macron's visit and the purposes of Macron's visit. Now, this visit has been a long time in preparation and discussion, and Macron visited Beijing in response to a long-term invitation from Xi Jinping. But it's clear to me that the timing of this visit was affected by Western alarm at what happened over the course of the meeting between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping in Moscow 2 weeks ago. The clear signs that the Chinese and the Russians are continuing to work together, in fact, are drawing even closer to each other. That triggered a wave of alarm in Washington and in European capitals. And the United States, for its part, I think, is becoming increasingly frustrated by its inability to have direct contacts with the Chinese government. So Secretary Blinken was supposed to travel to China a few weeks ago, but then the incident over the balloon, the Chinese balloon that flew over the United States, caused a postponement of that visit. The US, ever since, has been trying to get that visit back on track. The Chinese, for the moment, are refusing to receive Secretary Blinken. And the United States has also been working hard to try to get a telephone discussion or even a virtual summit set up between Xi Jinping and Joe Biden. Biden said that he wanted to speak to Xi Jinping to clear the air after the balloon incident. And again, the Chinese are refusing to speak with, they're refusing all requests to set up this telephone call. There have also been requests, pressure from the West for the Chinese to have a discussion with Zelensky in Ukraine. And there were some suggestions that Xi Jinping would speak to President Zelensky of Ukraine directly after his trip to Moscow. And that also hasn't happened. And it's not difficult to understand why the Chinese are refusing to entertain these calls. They're obviously furious with the US over the balloon incident, over Taiwan, but also they're not in the mood to receive any warnings, any threats from the United States over their proximity to Russia. So, unable to get their own people to Beijing or to establish direct contacts with Beijing, we see this troop of European dignitaries, Sanchez, Ursula von der Leyen, Macron, being sent to Beijing instead, carrying with them the same message that the United States, that the administration has been unable directly itself to give. And we see what happens. The Chinese have entertained all these visitors. They still retain some hopes that there might just possibly be flickers of strategic autonomy, as the Chinese like to say, by the Europeans from the United States. But they're disappointed. They have seen that the Europeans come along to China and they speak exactly the same tune. And we see how exasperated and frustrated the Chinese are becoming. Well, there we go. A debacle for Macron. As I said, he was, shall we say, the messenger of information that the Chinese didn't want to hear. It bewilders me, by the way, why he was happy, allowed himself to be used in that way. And I can't help but think that from a French point of view, Macron has once again let down France. As I said, in the old days, I can't imagine a Pompidou or even a Mitterrand, certainly not a Chirac, and of course inconceivable a de Gaulle, letting themselves be used in that kind of manner, or putting themselves in a position where they found themselves refusing to take no for an answer from the president of China, and thus damaging France's image in China and indeed the rest of the world. Well, China's not the only country on the receiving end of pressure at the moment. We've also heard that the United States has sent its CIA director, William Burns, who seems to act as a kind of unofficial emissary to Riyadh, where he's had meetings with Crown Prince, MBS and others, apparently, and where he's expressed US frustration that Saudi Arabia is working with Russia, cutting oil production, and has reopened political links to Iran. And again, I suspect that Burns, in fact, I'm sure that Burns will have been as coldly received in Riyadh as Macron was in France. Macron was in China. Well, there we are. In any negotiation, in any discussion, in diplomacy, a fundamental rule is that you take no for an answer. If the other side says no, you accept that and you move on. You should never get into a situation of trying to argue and reason, as Macron presumably imagines that he could do, the other side out of its well-established position. It doesn't work like that. The fact that the US and some of its European allies are engaging in this eccentric behavior, this deeply undiplomatic behavior, demonstrates once more that the United States and the Western powers have lost their gift for diplomacy. They no longer know what diplomacy is. A good visit by Macron to China would have steered clear of the whole topic of Ukraine entirely. Perhaps there might have been a few comments saying that there was a general agreement about the need to restore peace and to avoid use of nuclear weapons and that kind of thing, but it wouldn't have gone beyond that. It would instead have looked for points of agreement with China on other matters, of which there are many. Instead, as I said, the entire discussion seems to have been taken up by Ukraine and by Russia to the extreme exasperation of the Chinese. Now, I ought to say that alongside all of this, all of these diplomatic moves, alongside the preparations for the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive, the British media in particular has been writing article after article, which has been getting ever more bizarre. There have been articles about how Vladimir Putin might face his Julius Caesar moment. In other words, somebody would rush off and kill him in the way that Julius Caesar was murdered in the Senate on the 15th of March, 44 BC. There have been suggestions that General Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, might eventually, out of exasperation, launch a military coup against Putin. There have been reports about Putin's descent into paranoia, about how he only travels around Russia now in an armoured train. Lots of pieces like this. And there's also today an article in the Daily Telegraph about Saudi Arabia, how Saudi Arabia is at risk of being obliterated by China. Chinese production of electric vehicles is going to crush demand for Saudi Arabia's oil. So the inner message is Saudi Arabia shouldn't get close to China. There's also other articles about how Macron's failure in Beijing has supposedly enabled Xi Jinping to proceed with his master plan for world domination. I mean, I have you not, that's the actual title of this article does in fact refer to world domination. Now, I think I want to just explain briefly what the purpose of these articles is. They're not so much directed at the British public, though no doubt many people in Britain read them, they see the headlines, it helps them to form their view about the way in which the war is going, the diplomatic conflict is going. The major audience for these articles are the embassies of China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, all of those countries in London. They, of course, all check out and report to their capitals about any article that concerns their country. And, of course, they will be passing on to Moscow, Beijing and Riyadh summaries, at the very least summaries of these articles. They'll be passing them on to their foreign ministries, where they will be circulated amongst the, presumably to some extent at least, amongst the leaders of these countries. And of course the purpose of these articles is to sow doubt, to percolate within these countries, the leadership groups of these countries, a sense of worry and uncertainty. I don't think they have any such effect. I think by now, Saudis, the Russians, the Chinese have become used to this kind of thing. And of course, what it also does is that it simply confirms for all of these governments that the media, the once famously independent media of the West, of Britain in this case, has now simply become a sounding board and messaging platform for the British government. Anyway, that's me for the day. As I said, these are shorter videos because of the time constraints that I'm now working under. Just to remind you that you can find all our work on various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also, if you want to support our work, do so via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop, see the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our rucksacks. We now are also doing rucksacks and bottles and all sorts of great things. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for the day. Tomorrow, more news, possibly news about Bakhmut having fallen, or perhaps the fighting will still be going on. Anyway, that's me for the day, and have a very good day, and more from me soon.